Thank you. It's a great honor and delight to be here. In my 30 years as a career as an economist, I've had a lot of distinguished co-authors, but never a group as distinguished as this one. So I'm really very happy to be here. If you reporters call your favorite 3 or 4 economists, just choose your favorite 3 or 4, and ask them, what do you think about the idea of putting a price on carbon? My guess is that all of them, and certainly a vast majority of them, would say, yes, that's absolutely the right way to deal with climate policy. There is a complete consensus among economists that putting a price on carbon is the right thing to do. And this is economists from the left, from the right, and the middle. It's really a consensus view. And so what I want to do today is try to explain to you why it's such a consensus view among economists. I want to sort of emphasize 2 broad principles. The first broad principle that you've all sort of learned in what we call an Ec 10 at Harvard, maybe Econ 101, where you come from, is that decentralized market economies work better than centrally planned economies. You see that comparing the Soviet Union to the United States. You see it comparing East and West Germany. You see it comparing North and South Korea. I don't think there's any debate now that centrally planned economies don't work very well. Now think of how that lesson applies to climate change. The regulatory approach, the command and control approach, is basically taking the techniques of centrally planned economies and saying, oh, well, they don't work generally, but they're going to work here. And I think what we're going to learn is that, no, they're not going to work very well here. Just as they're costly when you try to run a whole economy in a command and control way, it's going to be very costly if you try to control carbon emissions in a command and control way. And the reason is really pretty simple, which is that the way in which we impact the climate is through many, many, many decisions as we go about our lives. So think about your personal carbon footprint. How do decisions you make every day affect your carbon footprint? Well, you have to decide what kind of car to drive. You have to decide where you're going to live, so therefore how far you're going to commute. You have to decide whether to carpool with your neighbor to work. You have to decide whether to take public transportation. You're going to decide what size house to live in. Once you buy the house, you can decide whether to change the windows to more fuel-efficient windows. There's literally hundreds of decisions that you're going to face throughout your life that's going to affect your carbon footprint. Well, if we're going to try to make those decisions correct ones via command and control, the government's going to have to go in there and micromanage your life to a degree that cannot possibly work in a free society. So you realize that any sort of command and control is going to leave lots of decisions unaffected and therefore not be the most efficient way of dealing with that. So what's the most efficient way of dealing with that? Well, let's go away from the centrally planned solution to the decentralized market solution. And how do markets work? Markets work by getting prices right, giving people the right set of incentives and saying, fine, you make the decision. Now that you face the right set of incentives, you decide whether to carpool to work, you decide what kind of car to drive, you decide whether to replace your windows. And what carbon pricing does is it gives people the right incentives. It then makes a lot of the micromanagement unnecessary. We can now sweep away those regulations because people are now incentivized to do the right thing given the right price of carbon. So it's basically moving away from a command and control centralized approach to a decentralized market-based approach where we trust individuals to make the right decisions once they face the right set of incentives. So that's sort of the first big lesson that I want to sort of leave you with. The second big lesson of economics, I believe, is that uncertainty is bad. Now, some uncertainty is a fact of life. We can't do away with all uncertainty. But generally, people don't like uncertainty for good reasons. It's very hard to make long-term plans in the face of uncertainty. And while we can't eliminate all uncertainty, one thing we can eliminate is uncertainty driven by policy. To the extent that policy is the source of uncertainty, that's something we can try to minimize. Well, right now we have a situation where we have a regulatory left and a deregulatory right, where the left wants to micromanage all these decisions in order to reduce our carbon footprint. The right says, oh my gosh, it's taking too big a toll on economic growth. Let's deregulate and not worry about climate change, just worry about promoting economic growth. If that's the situation we're going to leave ourselves with, then we're going to lurch back and forth between regulation and no regulation, and we're going to increase uncertainty going forward because who knows who's going to be president, what party is going to control the presidency in 10, 20, 30 years. That makes long-term planning all the more difficult. So what can we do? Well, we need some sort of compromise that, on the one hand, deals with the environmental problem, but doesn't do it in such a heavy-handed way that when more conservatives come in, they don't look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is killing economic growth. We need to move away. We need something in the middle that's going to both deal with the environment, but do it with a light enough touch that people are not going to worry about the impact on economic growth. And that's what I think is the brilliant part of this policy. It should appeal to both environmentalists who are worried about climate change and libertarians who want to get government out of people's lives. And I think it'll be good for both those groups, as well as, of course, as emphasized here, many, many Americans who are going to get these carbon dividends that are going to result from putting a price on carbon. So I think for those two big reasons, moving to a decentralized system and reducing policy uncertainty, this is good for the economy. Now, one of my favorite words when I read journalists is the word panacea. You guys use the word panacea a lot. And if you ever notice when you use the word panacea, there's always a not with it. This is not a panacea. Nothing ever is a panacea. Everything's not a panacea. Well, this is the closest thing I know to a panacea. It solves lots and lots of problems at once. You have a vast majority of policy wants to say this is the way to go, and the only thing that's standing in our way is to convince our leaders, and in particular the American public, that this is the way to go. That could leave them and the environment and the future descendants who are going to inherit the environment better off. So maybe it's not a complete panacea, but it's as close to one as I've ever seen. Thank you very much.